novels of Bernice Rubens are like those of no one else. From beyond the greying lace curtains, the shabby gentility of suburbia, she creates dazzling and bizarre desert flowers of human hopes and dreams. Her characters are as comic and sad and bizarre as their stories. Characters like the explorer Veronica Smiles in Our Father, who reluctantly bumps into God in the Sahara Desert. Or Norman in The Elected Member, chosen by his family to carry their guilt and expectations. That book won the Booker Prize in 1970. Or Madame Sazatska, the piano teacher who specialises in child prodigies. Bernice Rubens herself is the daughter of a refugee from the Tsar's Russia and was brought up in Cardiff. Today she lives alone in a spacious and elegant garden flat a mile or two north of Regent's Park in London. After 23 years of marriage, she's now divorced from her husband and her 2 daughters are grown up. She has a handsome, humorous face and dark hair and is just over 5 feet tall. In the sitting room, music scores were scattered over a Bechstein grand piano, and a cello she'd been playing lay on its side on the honey-coloured carpet. Her 2 brothers and a sister are all professional musicians. Apart from novels, Bernice Rubens has written for the stage, television and films. Making films for the United Nations has taken her to many countries around the world. She's been thrown out of both South Africa and Russia. Few novelists risk combining humour and grief as boldly as she does in her books. So I began our conversation by asking her whether, as she writes, she finds herself weeping at the pain in her stories or laughing out loud.
I think my intention has always been to write about sad things, because if you think of the subjects that concern me, like loneliness and despair and depression, they're all sad. And they end up by making people laugh. There's something quite ridiculous about the human condition anyway, that borders. The more tragic it is, the more hilarious it might be. And I think it's that borderline that I'm interested in writing on.
But you never consciously write to make people laugh as they read the book?
No, I never consciously write anything. I mean, I'm not conscious of what I intend to say, what message, as it were, I intend to put over. I don't have that kind of consciousness. And I'm glad I don't. I think if I did, the book wouldn't work.
Tell me a little bit about your childhood. You were one of 4 children born in Cardiff to a Jewish refugee from Lithuania. Why did he leave Russia, your father, and why did he choose Cardiff?
He left Russia because, as many did at that time, to avoid conscription. I mean, it was difficult enough being Jewish there. To be a Jew in the army would have been impossible. The route from Eastern Europe at that time was through Germany and Hamburg. And he went to Hamburg and didn't speak any German. He spoke Yiddish, and possibly with Yiddish he made himself known in Germany, but not known enough apparently to avoid being hoodwinked by a ticket tout, who gave him a ticket for what my father thought was America, but the ticket tout gave him a ticket for Cardiff and charged him for New York. My father was in Cardiff for 3 weeks under the impression he was walking the streets of New York.
It was
very naive,
shock.
you see. It was a terrible shock. But then there were other people who had been similarly hoodwinked, and there was a kind of little community between them. And they all started off, most of them started off in a kind of selling business that didn't involve an outlay of capital, because they didn't have any money. And the favourite pursuit was credit drapery. In other words, you would go and you would buy clothes and take those clothes to the valleys and sell them for £1 a week. So we were never very rich, but we were always reasonably happy.
Do you feel Welsh or Jewish primarily?
It doesn't matter what I think I am. In the eyes of everyone else, I'm Jewish. And I think that's an important factor. And one of the reasons why I don't fight anti-Semitism. I think anti-Semitism, like the poor, it's always going to be with us. Because I feel that man has a neurotic need for for scapegoating. It's the need to find someone to blame for all his own frustrations, his being out of work, his not being as successful as his neighbour. Now there are many targets for scapegoating. There's the blacks, the Jews, the Indians, the gays. There's no shortage of choice in targets. And as long as this remains a psychological necessity amongst people, I don't fight it. My feeling is anti-Semitism is their problem.
To me, as a non-Jew, it seems to me extraordinary that you can say that, given the appalling history of Jewish people.
I just feel that as long as people aren't satisfied, and people never will be satisfied, people will need somebody to blame. It's been the Jews' century. The blacks have had it too. The gays are having it now. Everyone gets their turn. You can't fight it.
Brothers is the major novel you published in 1983, which tells a story of 4 generations of a Jewish family, starting off in 1825 with the cruelties of Tsarist Russia, moving to Germany, to Wales, back to Russia, to present-day Israel. One of the messages of Brothers, it's a litany which is passed on from generation to generation, is the key importance of survival, that it's not worth dying for principles on behalf of God or your country, but the only things that are really worth dying for are love and friendship. Do you believe that yourself now?
I most certainly do. I've had thoughts about marching for 1 million people you don't know and not marching for the one you do. And I've come to the conclusion that I will not march for people I don't know. I will only march for those I do. But at the same time, I'm very glad that people are marching, if you know what I mean. My priority is looking after my children and not neglecting them in order to look after other people's children, because I think the damage done is absolutely irreparable. It's a moral question, really.
You said somewhere that for years in Britain you felt like a guest in someone else's home. Do you think you still feel that way?
No, I don't. My father used to say, on many occasions, remember you're a guest in this country. Although he himself was naturalized, and he spoke English well, he used to hammer it into us. Never forget you're a guest here. And it was kind of mantra that orchestrated our childhood for all of us. And I believed it. And I behaved like a guest. And then he died. He's buried in Wales, in Cardiff. And I felt with that piece of ground, I had a territorial right on the country, and I wasn't a guest anymore.
That you could be critical openly?
Well, once you stop being a guest, of course, you begin to get critical. You don't have to mind your manners anymore or wipe your feet, do you?
So what did you do?
Well, then I began to feel critical about England and the way we live.
What depresses you about it?
The terrible gap between the haves and the have-nots, which becomes more and more apparent. And I think it's very sad. I think we've also become a deeply Philistine country because we are being led by possibly the most Philistine Prime Minister we've ever had in our history. I find that pretty sad too. She's a woman totally lacking in imagination. That allows no room for lunacy or experiment. And she's mightily pleased with herself. And that's a characteristic that I loathe in anybody. It means that there's no inner questioning. There are no doubts, no self-doubts, no uncertainties. The uncertainties that that give you a certain fear, that all these things feed the imagination. And the imagination, like anything else, has to be nurtured.
When you were saying earlier that you felt like a guest in someone else's home, I was wondering whether you feel that the sense of being an outsider is actually central to the experience of being a novelist.
Yeah. I don't think I could live in Israel because, in that sense, I might run the danger, run the risk of being at home. And I think to be at home is to take the edge of that creative urge that I experienced in exile. Because although most of my novels are not on Jewish themes, I suppose I am considered a Jewish novelist. And as long as I feel a Jewish novelist, I will feel rootless outside Israel. I think the rootlessness is the creative source, frankly, and I'm grateful for it. I love Israel, and I'm deeply on Israel's side, despite the fact that there are things that... Do you remember, just now we were talking about scapegoatism and man's need to find someone to blame. Much as I love Israel, Jews are also available to this neurotic need. And we can see the manifestations of it today on their colonization of the West Bank. Something that deeply offends me, and many real Jews in the exile and in Israel itself.
Several of your novels are about people burdened with guilt, about failing to satisfy their parents' ambitions for them. Did your parents have very high expectations of your family?
Not that I was aware at the time, but I think it's part of Jewish luggage, you know. It's also part of non-Jewish luggage, except the Jews pack rather better because they are, or were, a refugee people for so many years in their history. They've had to live in the here and now. It's interesting, in the Jewish religion there is no notion of the hereafter. There's no cloud cuckoo land later on. If you've got something to do, you do it here and now. So there is this kind of presto living. And I think this might account for the family expectation.
In 1970, you published a novel, The Elected Member, which won the Booker Prize. It's an incredibly painful book, but it's also packed, it seems to me, with this black humour that is so often found in your books. His main character is Norman, the clever boy, the golden boy of a Jewish family who's a barrister, chosen by the family in a way to carry their burdens, the burden of expectation, of hopes, of failure, and finally of guilt as well. But by the age of 41, he's completely overwhelmed by this burden, and he's addicted to drugs, trapped by hallucinations and paranoia, and is eventually committed to a mental hospital. Now, you chose an epigraph by the psychiatrist R.D. Laing for this novel.
Yeah.
If patients are disturbed, their families are often very disturbing.
I felt that said it in a nutshell. That if parents expect things of their children, they are acting out their own frustrations, their own inadequacies. There's nothing original about the idea of the elected member. I mean, psychiatrists way back have had that notion of one member of the family being the scapegoat, carrying everybody's neurosis.
Did you intend the title to have a double meaning, of the elected member referring not only to Norman, elected by his family to carry their problems, but also to the Jewish race, chosen by God as a special people?
No, that wasn't an intention. And that's something that was pointed out to me by critics afterwards. And I say, oh yes. Well, why not? You see, these are not conscious things that one does. There are two things in writing. The writer writes, and the reviewer then tells the writer what he or she meant and what she's managed to do.
Do you find that fascinating or irritating?
I don't, on the whole, read the reviews. I used to, but I don't anymore. Because my feeling is that I know whether a book is good or bad. I don't need a reviewer to tell me. I know when I've conned people. I know when I've got away with it. My feeling is that everyone's got to earn a living, reviewers too, so let them get on with it. But for the first time in my career, when I wrote my last novel, Our Father, which is, not surprisingly about God, I was rather looking forward to the reviews, to read what they said I had written. I really didn't know what the book was about. And I thought, well, don't worry, the reviewers will tell me.
And did they?
No, I think they found it uninterpretable. It was open to so many interpretations, and I wasn't sure what it was about. But clearly it marked some kind of disturbance in me, and the fact that God was getting on my nerves. I couldn't be an out-and-out atheist.
The story of Our Father is about how Veronica Smiles was crossing the Sahara Desert, minding her own business, when she ran into God. That's your opening sentence of the book. And it's really a story, isn't it, about how God bothers this woman explorer, appearing in all sorts of bizarre disguises, even leaving messages on her answer phone, to force her to face and atone for her earlier tragic childhood in suburbia.
Yeah.
How did you get going with that book?
I don't know. The book was written as it was written. I mean, the device of opening drawers to go back to her childhood to find letters and things. I mean, I didn't know where it was going. But it was a book in which one sentence generated the next.
Do you often write like that, or do you normally have a much clearer idea?
In principle, I always write like that. But I think Our Father was the work that really discovered itself. That sounds terribly pseudo. And I used to go to my desk in the morning, and as Veronica opens a drawer in the novel to discover the next clue to her childhood, I would go to my desk and wait for the next clue to the novel. It was incredible writing that book. I loved writing it.
I love the idea of God leaving messages for her on the answer phone. How did that strike you?
I've often come home when I've got certain problems, usually domestic problems, and I've come in through the door and I go to the machine to see if there are any messages, and I think to myself, wouldn't it be nice if there were a message from God telling me what to do? You know, telling me, should I pay this bill? Should I make a fuss about it? Should I pay the parking fines or try to get away with it? Trivia. Just little domestic problems, and I thought it would be nice if God could tell me what to do, and it's a terribly childish thing to think. And I think everybody has, no matter how old you are. I think you're looking for a mother all the time. Or a father, whatever the disposition of your needs. I think I'm always looking for a mother.
Are you bothered by God in the way Veronica is bothered by God in the book?
Not as much as Veronica, but he doesn't get on my nerves as much. When I go to Israel, he bothers me. I mean, I defy anyone to go to Israel and not be bothered by God. All those reminders of Moses and Abraham and Jesus, it can get on your nerves.
Do you find that frightening sometimes?
No. I'm going to be interested to know how I'm going to face my own death, whether I'm going to let God in, because I've been keeping him out for so long. I would be interested to know if I shall die a believer.
Do you think you might?
I fear I might.
Why fear?
In principle, I don't want to believe. I think it's daft. The notion of God is daft. And I think that my intelligence might be impaired if I become a believer. And that's the fear. It requires a certain stupidity to believe in God. What am I saying? But that's how I feel. That really is how I feel. But nevertheless, I couldn't deny the God-bothering moment in my life.
Why do you think it's stupid to believe in God?
Perhaps stupid is the wrong word. I think that a belief in a God is what people use to postpone or even to avoid self-confrontation. As long as you're believing in something else, you don't have to look acutely at yourself. I think that's a cop-out. And I've always, much as I've disliked it, insisted on self-confrontation.
But in Our Father, God actually provokes Veronica into confronting herself because she has to face her past.
Yes, but Veronica's a little bit like me. She's trying to get rid of God. The fact that God does make her confront herself, you've just told me something about my belief, in fact. Perhaps I believe in God more than I've given out. That didn't occur to me. And that's an illustration, you see, of the writer not knowing what they're doing and of the critic telling her.
Do you feel that you make God appear in so many different ludicrous disguises to try and keep him at arm's length in that novel? I mean, it's terribly funny when you're reading it. He appears as a Superman in Veronica's bedroom one day. After she's slept with her future husband, she wakes up to find God in bed with her the next morning. She's not quite sure who's deflowered her. He appears as a waiter, as an orchestral violinist, dead drunk in a Moselle vineyard. I mean, the range of impersonations that God appears in is wonderfully entertaining, but it seems you're trying to keep him at arm's length by sending him up.
If you're afraid of accommodating a person, you have to ridicule them. And that's one way of excusing yourself from accepting them, because they're silly, they're drunk, or they're lechers. You diminish them.
Do you find that unnerving, that you need to do that?
Not unnerving, I find it interesting, which is why I'm looking forward to my dying. I don't want to die, who wants to die? I'm wondering whether God will win me over in those last days, or whether I shall continue to fight it. I hope I'll fight. But you know, I think when you die, I think you must entertain a different kind of fear, and that you're really not in a position to offend God or the devil, as it were, since the notion of a heaven and hell must become quite acute in those last days.
In Our Father, you've drawn a picture of this ludicrous God on the one hand, but in the end it's a God who is obeyed. But it seems to me very much a God of vengeance.
Yes, well, if I've got to believe at all in any God, I'd sooner believe in one who's bloody-minded, who's jealous, who's full of revenge, as well as loving kindness. That makes him much more human.
Why do you want a human God?
The small human error makes him more acceptable. In any case, what makes Judaism different from Christianity is the notion of the chosen. Now, once you have the Jews as the chosen people, they have to be punished if they don't live up to God's choice. So you have the punitive God, and you have the jealous God. Because wouldn't it be awful if God had made a mistake? He's chosen the Jews, and the Jews have to merit that choice. And if they don't, they'll be punished. And if they do, they'll be loved.
There's a bit in The Elected Member where Norman screams at God